last year to discuss issues globally and locally that impacted the lives of everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, regardless of nationality, gender or ethnicity. We aspire to have the courage to address the issues that matter most towards Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and we invite all people, irrespective of faith or creed, to join us. Over the past decade, this has become more difficult given the war on terror and the use of various policies including PREVENT and the newly enacted Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, which have had a chilling effect on honest and legitimate discourse. With all of that said, I'm just going to introduce our chair for this evening, Nadia Chan, who is currently an NLM student and whose research interest lies primarily in terrorism and criminal law. She's involved in a number of grassroots campaigns which focus on Muslim prisoners. Thank you.
Just okay here for everyone to turn up. Got a good turnout. Today's event is entitled Brothers Behind Bars, the Plight of the Muslim Prisoner in the Context of the War on Terror. Under the guise of the war on terror, the UK has adopted a series of policies and laws to prioritise what they call national security measures over basic principles of justice and fairness. The impact of counter-terrorism policies and practices have resulted in alienation and criminalisation of the Muslim community. Prejudice and ill-informed and even fabricated accounts of terrorist acts produced through forced or coerced confessions have been the basis to justify a whole raft of anti-terrorism legislation and illegal and immoral actions in the UK. The most obvious victims of this state repression are the wrongly imprisoned Muslim prisoners. The plight continues to be largely ignored within academic, media and government institutions. Thank you for joining us. Our first speaker today is Moazzam Begg, ex-Guantanamo detainee and Director of Outreach and Cage Representative. Thanks.
In the name of Allah, most compassionate, most merciful, good evening to everyone, assalamu alaikum. I have to admit, for this evening I haven't prepared a thing at all. I don't really know what I'm going to talk about. Other than the fact that I guess I don't need to prepare anymore, because speaking about the plight of the prisoners isn't just an abstract or an academic exercise for me. It's something I've lived for several years, since 2001. And talking about my own experiences is something I've done so many times I'm bored of hearing my own voice. So it's important to just get into some context, why and how we're here. And I can't help but to remember every time I see my lawyer Gareth Pearce, is that when I came back from Guantanamo in 2005, she didn't have time enough to speak to me because she had to rush off for an impending decision about the detention without charge or trial, not in Guantanamo, but here in the United Kingdom, of 16 Middle Eastern and North African men who'd been detained without charge or trial. The ruling in their case was that it had been unconstitutional, i.e. illegal, for the government to have held them in such a state. And so whilst Guantanamo was taking place and people were being tortured and abused and the world was rightly trying to, at least to be seen to be condemning it, nobody spoke about this, about what was taking place right here in Britain. Nobody mentioned the Guantanamoization of British prisons and the British legal system, the English legal system, whereby law after law was being passed over us, and as we've seen over the past 14 years, almost one new piece of anti-terror legislation or more is being passed that de facto, almost only applies to the Muslim community. And the most recent of which, of course, is the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act in January of this year, which was passed, which places a statutory duty upon teachers, upon lecturers, upon doctors and nurses and others to defile that sacred relationship between teacher and student, between doctor and patient, which essentially says that these privileged relationships are now subject to what the government will determine will be the idea of extremism. So these people in the public sector are now, after 14 years, 15 years of the war on terror, told to define and identify and scrutinize what may or may not be a Muslim turning to extremism. For of a surety, the primary factor in all of this is that you must be a Muslim. Just as in Guantanamo, the primary factor must be that you are a Muslim, not that you're a terrorism suspect. Because there are no Tamil Tigers there are no real IRA there are no Shining Path guerrillas there. You must be a Muslim, primarily, first and foremost, to be a prisoner in Guantanamo. And so, you've seen this week the return, or a couple of days ago, of Shakir Ahmed. The most disgusting case you could probably ever come across. Outrageous in its facts. That a man could be held for 14 years, without charge or trial, subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, not just at the hands of the United States government, but with full complicity and the full involvement and endorsement of our own government, which simultaneously talks about the rule of law. The rule of law, get this into your heads. A government that talks about the rule of law, that is complicit in the detention without charge or trial of its own citizens and residents. How hypocritical could you possibly be? How much more hypocritical could you be than that? But that's at the far end of the war on terror. It's still hard to envisage, hard to imagine what Guantanamo really means. For the few of us who were held there, even for us it's hard to describe. But then when you look here in the United Kingdom, when I was imprisoned in 2014, I understood that people in the government don't like me, or people like me, because we call for accountability. We keep showing them up every single time they've been involved in one abuse or the other of human rights. We turn up, pointing the finger, showing the evidence, which place, which time, which date was our government involved in the abuse of its own citizens. But then I saw, for example, two young Muslim men from Birmingham who had gone to Syria in 2013 at a time when our own government was supplying non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army, which fought alongside every rebel group, including Al-Qaeda in Syria, and shared resources and battlefronts. These two young men had gone over at that time when our government and its foreign minister was talking about bombing the Assad regime. The messages and the signals they were sending to these young men was that it's not a crime to support the fight against it. Things have changed, of course, vastly since the despicable so-called Islamic State has risen. But at the time, that's the message that was coming across. So these two young men went over. They stayed with one of the rebel groups. They fought, they didn't like what they saw, especially with the rise of ISIS. So they decided to return back to Britain. Their mother had been encouraged by the police to go and report the case to the police, and they said to her that we will assist you. They didn't know, she didn't know, that in fact she was reporting a crime to the police. And that as a result of that reporting, the two young men, 18 and 19-year-old kids, were going to be arrested as a result. But not only were they arrested, they were prosecuted. And they were convicted. And they were given 12 years and 8 months in prison. Because of the fact that they came back voluntarily, because they didn't want to be part of ISIS. Yes, they may have done or said some silly things, as teenagers often do. But did it mean, as when the police arrested them, that there was no threat, as the police said, there was no threat to the safety or security of the British public? that with these men, regardless of that statement by the police, they're still going to be given 13 years without the opportunity to actually explain what this was all about? Is that the situation that we're in? Every time almost that you see, and you can check this up if you don't believe me, that there's been an arrest over the past couple of years, the police are quick to say that there was no threat to the safety or security of the British public. Now, if that is the case, what's happening? Why are these laws being pushed one after the other? We already have more laws and measures than most of the European countries in order to be able to tackle extremism and terrorism and so forth. Yet, we have seen law after law being passed applied to the Muslim population of this country and being targeted and vilified. And simultaneously, just so you get some measures, some ideas of what I'm talking about, in the same year, a young ex-British soldier, 19 years old, from Manchester, was found with 2 improvised explosive devices. He said he had extra pieces of shrapnel, 187 pieces in each, for maximum effect and damage. They found that he had beheading videos of the Ku Klux Klan and the Russian white supremacist organizations. He had no surrender EDL flags, and he had an array of weapons in his house. But when the judge gave the judgment on him, he never used the word terrorist to describe it. In fact, he said this man is not a terrorist. And he was given 2 years under a 19th century Explosives Act. And that's the comparison, where you can clearly see somebody poses a major threat to the safety and security of the British public. And on the other side, the police say there is no threat. How is this possible? How has terrorism and extremism and everything that comes with it allowed us to become so lopsided in our view of how we're looking at our communities? I say it's disgusting. I say we've been hoodwinked. I say we've been had. And because the various media organizations and tabloid press and beyond keep pushing this mantra of how dangerous and scary and frightening Muslims are, and ignorance is bliss, so the majority of the population who will never be affected by these laws will say, well, I've got nothing to hide, I haven't done anything wrong, why should I worry? Well, that's right. Treat your minorities this way. It was Mandela who said, you can judge a nation by how they treat their minorities and how they treat their prisoners. And he would know, of course, because after all, call us as much as we want terrorists, the most respected man on the planet, don't you ever forget, the most respected man on the planet was a convicted terrorist. What are you going to do about that? I'll tell you what, we're going to build a statue of him right outside Parliament to commemorate him. That's what we're going to do. As late as 2008, Mandela was on a no-flight list to America. It was ridiculous. But nonetheless, this is the type of rhetoric we've been taught to buy, that the Muslims are a problem, that we need more laws and we need more measures and we need unprecedented legislation, the likes of which we didn't even put through at the height of the IRA campaign. And let's not forget, we've had people within Parliament say that the Muslim threat is the greatest one ever to face this country. And again, silly people will buy it. Have they forgotten the Troubles? Have they forgotten that after the execution of people protesting against internment, i.e. detention without trial, in the city of Derry, people rose up? Have they forgotten that 3,000 people died in that conflict? 3,000. Have they forgotten the measures that they instituted and criminalized the community as a result, and said the Irish community are the ones who are terrorists? because we haven't forgotten, and if we have, we're to blame. Because there is precedent for this type of behavior and this type of demonization. And we have to remind them constantly that in the end, these laws, these measures, this behavior, this demonization, this alienation, this vilification of an entire community can only do one thing: push people into a corner. You want to make people adhere to some amorphous set of British ideas and values that you can't even adhere to yourself? How can you talk about the rule of law when you have consistently detained people without charge or trial? When you've consistently removed the presumption of innocence? When you've consistently been involved in or complicit in the torture of your own citizens and others? When you have invaded countries based on false, tortured testimony? When you have drone striked and killed your own people without any legal process? How can you dare to talk about the rule of law and the non-adherence to this British value that doesn't exist? How can you celebrate 800 years since the signing of the Magna Carta and claim that we hold on to this idea as a civilizational factor to the rest of the world that we exported, that is part of their constitutions to this day? How can you say, to no man will justice be denied or delayed, and you have a man called Shakir Ahmed whose wife and children are all British, 14 years, doesn't see a day of justice? And those same tabloids who complain consistently about the Muslim threat after a man has been tortured and abused, what do they say? He should have been executed. He's lucky. He should thank Britain for bringing him back. He should thank the Americans. He could have been in Saudi. He could have been in another country. He could have been in one of those despotic Muslim countries. And they're like, as I said before, like the rapist, where the rapist wants to be excused. In fact, he wants to be praised because he stopped the rape. It's like the famous saying of Malcolm X: you take a knife, you don't take a knife and stick it in a man's back 9 inches deep, put it back 5 inches, say, we've made progress. That's precisely what they're asking us to do. To thank them because of the end of the abuse. Normally what happens if somebody abuses you and tortures you in rightly minded societies, you give them an apology. The criminal, the perpetrator, is made to say, I'm sorry, I will not do that again. We've not seen anything like that at all. We've seen more and more language, belligerent language, and measures being passed by politicians and media. We've seen no accountability. With all of this, who's been held accountable? Torture is a crime. False imprisonment is a crime. Abuse of human rights is a crime. If anybody amongst this audience here was caught falsely imprisoning somebody just for a couple of hours, you'd be arrested. Just for a couple of hours, imagine 14 years. If you were to torture somebody, imagine what would happen to you. So how is it possible that the governments can get away with this? I'll tell you why, how it's possible. Because the victims are Muslims. The victims are Muslims. That's how they can get away with it. That's how they've done it. And up until we stand up and count ourselves and say we are equal citizens, they'll continue to do so. I'm going to end there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Asif Uddin, the spokesperson for the Justice for Ani Sardar campaign.
الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Greetings and salutations. Just before I begin, I just want to have a show of hands of how many people in this audience have heard of an individual by the name of Anis Sardar. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this you'll remember his name. So who is Anis Sardar? Anis Sardar is a British citizen who's facing, or in fact, he is facing a 38-year jail sentence for a crime he hasn't committed. Now, you may have heard this statement, or this phrase, a crime he hasn't committed, a number of times. But what if I were to say that even the prosecutors failed to prove that he committed the crime? What if I were to say that even his defense were unchallenged? Would that not make you think? Would that not give a different meaning to this almost cliched phrase that crime that he hasn't committed? So what is the story or the background of Anis Sardar? Anis was a student of Islamic knowledge. In the mid-90s, he decided to travel to what was then a peaceful Syria to pursue his studies in the Arabic language. And he stayed there for around 10 years. During his time, an influx of refugees came through the borders of Iraq. And as a result of the invasion of Iraq. And during this period, he befriended one of these Iraqi refugees by the name of Abu Muhammad. And Abu Muhammad had his parents in Iraq, and he wanted to bring them to the safer Syria. So he decided to make his way to Iraq, and as a result, knowing what we know about Anis and how helpful he is, he offered Abu Muhammad, his friend, a hand. He got on the back of a truck full of medical equipment, and he went to the village of Abu Muhammad, and he attended the wounded. He helped a number of people from this village to a safer place. So during this period, he had seen what could be described as being one of the worst periods that Iraq has seen. One of the broadsheet journalists, when asked about Iraq, despite the fact that he has gone to Rwanda and he's seen the genocide that's taken place in Rwanda, in describing what happened between this forgotten time from 2005 to 2008, he says to people, don't ask me. Because this is what, some of the things that Anis saw were really horrific. He saw dead bodies in the canals, with bodies being drilled, eyes gouged out. And I don't want to go further in describing some of the things that he had seen. So these are some of the scenes that he had witnessed. People being killed and people being abducted from this village. On one afternoon, Abu Muhammad and Anis, they went to a neighboring village. There, Anis was left by himself, where Abu Muhammad went to do some other things. And he saw some of the people in this house and asked them what they were doing. They said that our children, our wives, our brothers, our fathers, our uncles are being killed and they're being abducted by the neighboring village, who come from, who support the ruling militia. For during this time, anyone who was Sunni in that particular area was facing great aggression. So he asked them, what are you doing? And they were making some IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Anis was asked to take one of them. Not being able to help the Iraqis any further, Anis decided to go back to Syria to finish his final year at university. Really damaged and dealing with the psychological effects of what he had witnessed, he decided to go back to the UK. He couldn't take it anymore. He needed some element of normalcy. So he completed his final year at one of the UK universities. and he got married. He did the knowledge and qualified as a black cab driver. And he settled in once again. In 2014, last year, 2 days before he was planning on going on Hajj, which is the greater pilgrimage for Muslims, his house was raided. In 2007, when he initially left Syria, a few months after Anis returned to the UK, a US Army vehicle went in an area that US Army vehicles don't usually go to. So it was a stray US Army vehicle. They don't go on the dirt tracks, but they just stay on the roads. And this is something that the prosecution admitted also. One of the army officers by the name of Randy Johnson was killed as a result. And there was no evidence that Anis's fingerprint was on that IED. So in 2015, this year, Anis was found guilty of a murder he did not commit. His lawyer, who is present here, Gareth Pearce, said clearly that she had access to extremely powerful potential witnesses that could have exonerated or led to the exoneration of Anis Sardar. But unfortunately, the witnesses, one after the other in court, were rejected because they were not given the right amount of protection to stop their identities being leaked to the Iraqi militia, ruling militia, or the police. So they could not guarantee their protection. Anis has never been a threat to anyone. Before he left for Syria, and once he came back from Syria, and the fact that he did not do anything, the worst crime he probably did in the UK is just a parking fine that most of us have committed. But he's never been a threat to anyone. I want you to imagine if a white, non-Muslim British man went to fight an evil regime such as ISIS today, and he joined one of the Kurdish groups or something like this, and an American officer was killed in similar circumstances. Really? Can you say with your hand on your heart that he would have got 38 years, like Anis Sardar? If we are able to use different labels for identical cases that have massively different outcomes, then we know that justice is not being sought. Once we move away from the basic principles of truth and equality, we are acting like the countries that we criticize. This case of Anis Sardar was bereft of any context. And this context, that should have been the greatest witness, that couldn't take the witness stand on that day of court, is a proof of this. That every witness that was presented to the courts was rejected. Knowing of such great and grave misjudgments, living in this country, honestly, can you ask yourself, do you feel safe? I seriously doubt that any single member of that jury that gave Anis a guilty verdict would bet their own lives on the fact that Anis killed that American soldier. How could they without any evidence? I want you to think about this. How many of you, and I apologize in advance for asking an embarrassing question, how many of you are younger than 38 years old? That's a vast majority of this audience. Anis will be in jail for longer than you've been alive. I want you to also think about something else. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know of a 3-year-old. Maybe this 3-year-old is your son. Maybe this 3-year-old is your daughter, a nephew or a niece. Anissa's daughter just turned 3 days ago. She will not see her father free until she is 40 years old. So what can you do? I just want to mention 3 things before I close on what you can do. The first thing is to join the Justice for Anis campaign, Facebook campaign. This has got a 4, it's not F-O-U-R, it's just the letter, it's the number 4. And join it so you can find out about the updates and get your friends to do this. Get at least each person in this audience to get at least 10 people to join this Facebook page. The second thing that I want you to do is to help the campaign by presenting or getting in contact with us in any way that you can that will help the campaign. Maybe you're very good at making documentaries, maybe you have a lot of money that can make documentaries. And the final thing is that if you know anyone, any person of prominence, any person who's respected in society, then get them to get in contact with us so that they can give a supporting statement. Alhamdulillah, we have the support now of Noam Chomsky, who has talked very briefly and given a statement regarding the travesty of justice that is found in the case of Anis Sardar. Jazakumullah khair, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker, Farooqi. Munir Farooqi's son, who spearheads the campaign Free Munir. Harris was indeed his father's co-defendant. However, all charges against him were dropped and he was cleared. Harris' arrest and subsequent charge was based largely on information gained by 2 undercover police officers who posed as vulnerable individuals interested in Islam, who later in the deployment pretended to convert to Islam and further be interested in politics and war.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. You can hear me all right, yeah? As the sisters mentioned, yes, I'm part of the Free Munir Farooqi campaign. My father was being unjustly given 4 life sentences for crimes he never committed. Munir Farooqi, he ran dawah stores in the Manchester area for many years, starting from approximately 2003. There were multiple dawah stores in Manchester that he operated. The police and the council, Manchester City Council, harassed him in many ways, trying to basically bring an end to the dawah stores because they could see the success that it was giving, showing the complete opposite of what you see on the media, where Islam is nothing but peace. And there were many shahadas that took place within the years. From my father's dawah store, they were comprised of numerous CDs, leaflets, DVDs, basically showing the similarities of Islam and similarities Islam has with other faiths and the benefits it can give in society. After being pestered by the authorities for many years, approximately in 2000, towards the end of 2008, the counter-terrorism unit launched an operation, an intense operation that cost the taxpayer millions of pounds, and it consists of 2 undercover officers who casually come to the store, showed an interest in Islam, and within the early days of deployment, they become Muslim and lived as Muslims within the community for approximately a year. To the extent that they changed their whole attire. They're from clean shaven, they grew fist-length beards. They were at literally every salah in the first saf, attending Quran lessons. I mean, the list is endless. They fitted themselves into society, into the community portraying themselves as reverts. And their operational agenda was to come out, basically prove and uncover this terrorism group, terrorism gang, which is operating within Manchester. But this is what was alleged. My father's dawah style was basically whoever was interested in Islam, he would literally drag them to the house and talk in conversation with them over food, have breakfast, lunch and dinner with them. And this is what obviously they realized, so they started to spend endless hours at our house talking about religion, which will slowly drift towards jihad and politics. So literally every conversation that these undercover officers had, it was recorded. First it was recorded, not just the conversations that took place with myself, my father and the other co-defendants that were arrested, but within the whole community, for one whole year, there was thousands of hours of recording that took place and profiling each individual. The operation lasted for approximately 1 year, and towards the end of 2009, my father, myself, and the imam of a local mosque and 2 other individuals were arrested, and it was alleged that we were recruiting people from the streets of Manchester and sending them overseas to Afghanistan to fight against coalition troops. Obviously, the evidence that the counter-terrorism unit put forward in the courts was literally to fit their own agenda. The conversations were heavily taken out of context, to the extent that one of the main pieces of evidence that was used against my father was a 2.5-hour conversation was cut down to 15 seconds, where his wording was taken out of context and which led to one of the life sentences that he's serving. The undercover officers, they were pretty good at their job. I must give them credit for that, because they would literally stalk me in the streets of Manchester and just randomly bump into me on the streets, having 3 things in mind. Firstly, to talk about jihad, to talk about politics, and to take literally every single conversation, like I said, out of context. During the court, it was said that the operation which they held, there's 3 stages of being a terrorist, and the first stage is to declare that there's no God but Allah and the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger. The second stage was seen to when you're trying your best to practice deen to the best of your ability. So these 2 stages, it was said, were the 2 steps of terrorism, which led to the 3rd step, which is actually committing a crime of terrorism, which could be to blowing something up, to just uttering a few words that can be taken out of context. Towards the end, once the conviction was taking place, the head of the counter-terrorism unit, Tony Porter, confessed to the BBC that there was no evidence, no action plan or end game found for these men, apart from an ideology that was created by 2 undercover officers, because after one whole intense year of undercover operation, the only 2 people that were to go and fight against coalition troops were the officers, nobody else. Once the convictions had taken place, I myself was acquitted, and I was supposed to be the right-hand man of my father. The main person that was arrested, the imam, he was never charged after a year's undercover operation. But the oppression didn't end to just the convictions. The second stage of the oppression was to seize our family home, because they believed that many conversations that had taken place where they had invited themselves into our house, it was said that this was the hub of terrorism. So they tried in every possible way to seize the house, not just our house, but our main income, which are 2 of the properties that are owned by the family. This was taken into court. We won the case, but the only downfall to that is we were paid £500,000 to cover court costs and my father's legal proceedings that took place. The case, it is difficult to explain the full year's intense operation, but the main focus of the campaign now is to focus on my father's healthcare, because he's been in prison for 7 years and the authorities now are literally persecuting him by neglecting his healthcare. He's had over 60 missed medical appointments, which are not only leaving him 80% blind, but he's losing sensation in his lower limbs. So we're urging people to inshallah come forward, educate yourself on this case, because it's not about my father. This whole case proves that it's Islam that's under the microscope, not just individuals, on the streets. Because if the 3 stages of terrorism, becoming a terrorist, is to embrace Islam, the first 2 steps is to embrace Islam and live according to Islam to the best of your ability, then potentially every Muslim within the UK is under threat. So inshallah, we've got a stall outside highlighting the case, and I urge you to come forward and speak in detail. Jazakallah.
Thanks. Our next speaker is Nikki Jameson, reporter from the Fighting Racism and Fight Imperialism. FRFI is the only left-wing paper in Britain that regularly reports and supports the struggles of prisoners against oppressive conditions and for basic human rights.
Thank you. Can you hear properly? Yeah. Okay. Well, as Nadia said, I'm speaking on behalf of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and if you haven't heard of us before, you probably would have asked, what is a communist organisation doing in a meeting dedicated to the support of Muslim prisoners? But it is true, as she said, that we are, in that sense, unique on the left in Britain, in that we dedicate a large part of our political energy to supporting the struggles of people who are in prison. And that didn't begin with Muslim prisoners, I have to say. The newspaper, which our paper's over there, has been going since 1979. And even then, when the newspaper began, the organisation was already in existence, and one of its main political focuses was the Irish struggle against British imperialism. And we corresponded with and acted in solidarity with Irish prisoners, many of whom then wrote back to us and said, there are other people in here who aren't necessarily Irish, who are not necessarily political prisoners, who might be in here for any number of reasons, but who are in all kinds of struggle and dispute and are having their rights abused, and they need you to support them. So we kind of took up this mantle, and it's something we've continued to do today. And both the campaigns who've spoken before, we've tried the comrades that we have in London and in Manchester, where the Farooqi campaign is based, to support them. So what we do in general as a way of support, I mean, it's not particularly rocket science. We write to prisoners, we get letters back from them, we publish their accounts, and we assist to organise demonstrations outside prisons. And I'll talk a little bit more. I was told to talk for quite a short time, so I'll try to. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just want to show you and read from, because a few years ago we began to realise how obvious it was that the latest, as Moazzam said when he spoke, the latest group of people who were being persecuted in prison were no longer Irish, they were Muslim. And not only were they the Muslim prisoners who were there for under the laws of terrorism, they had become ordinary Muslims who were in prison for no kind of political or religious reason, but by their very identification with Islam were also being treated as though they were terrorists, were also being dug out. And I wrote this article in 2011, and I'll just read a tiny little bit out of it, because it tells you that all Muslim prisoners treated with suspicion, Although terrorism-related prisoners comprise, this is 4 years ago, the statistics might have changed, approximately 1% of the 10,300 Muslims imprisoned in England and Wales, all Muslim prisoners are treated with suspicion. As the Chief Inspector of Prisons has reported, there are two separate and sometimes conflicting approaches. The first, through the diversity lens, focuses on ensuring appropriate religious observance and identifying and preventing discrimination on grounds of religion. The second, through the lens of security, focuses solely on Muslims as potential or actual extremists. At present, the latter approach appears to be better resourced, better understood and more prevalent. In 2009, the Prison Service amended its guidance on religious worship to specifically exclude prisoners in high security prisons from leading Friday prayers, including when an imam is unavailable, which in other prisons would mean a suitably experienced prisoner would step in. This guidance applied only to Islam, and strict parameters were also drawn up to limit private group worship outside of formal services. The implication was clear. Muslims must not congregate for prayer or discussion, and any attempt to do so should be viewed with suspicion. On 9th of January, this is still 4 years ago, prisoners at Long Lartin staged a peaceful protest against attacks on their rights, including the ban on any religious activity outside of formal services, and a change to the visiting system whereby anyone over the age of 10 would be counted as an adult. A clear attack on prisoners with large families, the majority of whom are Muslim. Happy to say that part about the large families was changed. But since that time, we've seen as part of our role to give a voice to the people inside, because it isn't just about delineating the repression. I mean, speaker after speaker can tell you how racism exists and how the oppression exists, but we want also to be able to give a voice to resistance. And it's not easy resisting, as the people who've spoken will be able to tell you who are related or have been there. It's not easy resisting within a high security prison, but it becomes a little bit easier when you know that you have solidarity on the outside. So what we've undertaken to do is publish the account. Sorry, this one's really mucky and manky, but you can see this says oppression of Muslim prisoners in British prisons, and this was sent to us from Frankland. And then it was followed up almost immediately by somebody who read that and then thought they would write to us to follow up from it. Britain's most racist prison. Okay, he's done audience participation. Can anybody guess Britain's most racist prison? It's not actually. It's Strangeways, Manchester, according to somebody who's been to several of them. And I'll just read you a little extract from his before I finish. I was born and raised in the UK, yet the sentencing remarks in my trial said, "You purport to be a British citizen, but what you stand for is totally alien to what we stand for in our country." This alienation and marginalisation set the backdrop to how Muslims are systematically subjugated and dehumanised, what is fundamentally an institutionally racist criminal justice system. I have now spent time in 10 prisons, and the most racist by far is Strangeways in Manchester. I spent 2.5 years there, during which time prison officers and governors radicalised me more than any cleric probably ever could. Upon reception in November 2011 from Belmarsh, I hadn't even reached the wing before I was told by a senior officer in the prison's counter-terrorism unit that Muslims are prohibited from wearing our religious cap topi outside of their cells. When I was located to a wing, they ensured I was isolated from anyone with a similar background to me. Officers would then disclose to local gangs of friends that I am a terrorist, as implicit incitement. On more than one occasion, officers located confirmed EDL supporters in the neighbouring cell. In February 2013, roll on a little bit, I was given a wing job. I wore my topi on the landing. When I refused to move it, I was sacked and my privilege level downgraded. February 2014, I sent a judicial review pre-action protocol on the topi prohibition, which had been in effect since 2010. A few days later, they finally rescinded it. In March 2014, officers began inciting prisoners to challenge my wearing the topi. This led to a physical altercation instigated by at least 3 racists. I was assaulted on the landing, but the screws just stood around as if nothing happened. I then defended myself, and only then did the alarm go off, and the screws restrained only me. I was stripped of all privileges for only over a month. The assailant was downgraded from enhanced to standard level, thus retaining some privileges. I was placed on an anti-bullying scheme for over 2 weeks. The assailant was on it for 6 days. Now that might sound like a kind of don't stand up and fight in a way, you only get worse time, but the prohibition on religious headgear has been overturned, and solidarity, the person concerned wants to get their stuff out there, they want more accounts to be there. So, like the two speakers who said, you know, sign up and get involved with things. I mean, we try to distribute this material because what we think we can be on the outside, and we are political activists, we're socialists, we're not religious, and sometimes we have disputes of politics, religion or whatever, but we see it as part of our solidarity work, our action against imperialism, our action to prevent the endless divide and rule, which is what capitalist society does when it says, there's the bogeyman, they're Irish, there's the bogeyman, they're Muslim, there's the bogeyman, they're a foreigner. Blame them. Don't blame the government for the fact that you've got, you know, things are being cut. Don't blame blame these people. See them, they're the other. Ignore them. Turn your back on them. We think it's the important part of our political work to show solidarity in the face of that, and part of that is trying to give a voice to the people who are inside to get their word out about what's happening.
Our last speaker this evening is Gareth Pearce, a human rights lawyer, senior partner at Bernberg, Pearce and Partners, who represented Moazzam Begg and Sardar, amongst others. Gareth is best known for her work and advocacy in high-profile cases involving allegations of human rights injustices. Gareth also represented many ex-Guantanamo detainees. In 30 years as a lawyer, Gareth has represented the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, amongst others. Thanks.
Each of the cases, the injustices that have been spoken about have certain resonances. Each of them is determined by a view, a narrative of complex world conflicts, one way or another. Munir Farooqi was a man who had a history of involvement a long time before, at a time when that involvement was never viewed as terrorist activity. And Sardar was in Iraq in 2007, in a conflict, if you call it a conflict, that was triggered by the UK and the US invasion in 2003. And the narrative under which cases now are being prosecuted and were prosecuted, the narrative under which many men and occasionally women are now in British prisons, was a narrative determined effectively by the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who said, when I saw the planes going to the Twin Towers, I suddenly realized, before the pieces fell, that this was a kaleidoscope and the pieces of the map of the world were joined up, and I could see it very clearly. Before the pieces fell, we had to reorder the world. If you were ever to read his memoirs, I recommend it. These are the words he used. And the world he saw that had to be reordered was a world in which the conflicts that he saw in a joined up pattern that had to be eliminated, he described it as a virus to be exterminated, were liberation movements in Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria. He saw them around the world as a joined up pattern that had to be tackled. And what we are now working through in our criminal justice system is the way we have applied that narrative and determined what is terrorism and what is not. And in the process, we have accused individuals before the courts who are part of an accused community, the Muslim community. And those individuals, defendants, awaiting trial, on trial, making decisions about what they should do at trial, know, and they know it with good reason, that they are part of a whole community in this country that is not just viewed with suspicion, but found guilty in much of the public determination before they stand trial, and that their jury, the jury who will try them, will see them as part of that community and will believe in advance of the trial that they are guilty. But guilty of what? This is the question. And there are a host of young people now in prison, awaiting trial or convicted, or who have pleaded guilty, who have no idea why they are guilty. Absolutely no idea. The definition of terrorism is so expansive that anyone can be caught on it. And you can go to a lawyer, even an experienced lawyer, and say, am I guilty or not? Will I be found guilty or not? And the lawyer will be unable to tell them, or profess to be unable to tell them. The definition of terrorism is that if by the use of violence, any form of violence, not necessarily serious violence, by the use of violence, you attempt to influence a government, any government, for a religious, ideological, or political purpose, that is terrorism. That is terrorism. And it doesn't matter what or who the government is. And so a succession of men, including Moazzam, have been prosecuted on the basis of going to a country, Syria, where a ruthless, brutal dictator, who with his father had a 40-year history of what was described as a one-party democracy, a 40-year history of torture and false imprisonment, and in some cases genocide of its own citizens. When that brutal dictator responded to peaceful protest, part of the Arab Spring, by mass killings, brutal torture, when there was a response to that the prosecutors in this country determined was terrorism. To fight a man committing war crimes, dropping barrel bombs on civilian populations, eliminating city after city, town after town. So Syria now doesn't exist in its urban areas. It's like looking at Stalingrad in World War II. It is a crime to have gone to Syria, to join the Syrian people to act in self-defense. That's what the prosecution says in case after case after case. And the two young men that Moazzam referred to, who've been sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, were advised to plead guilty. To plead guilty to being terrorists, for having gone to Aleppo, not joined any prescribed group at all, not at all, to have worked with a brigade in which they were not good enough to be soldiers. They were put to look after children, and to pick up dead bodies when there'd been a bombing and take them to the morgue. That's what they did. That's why, as Moazzam said, they're traumatised, both suffering from colossal post-traumatic stress disorder. And they've been sentenced to 12 years. But their lawyers said it's terrorism because it ticks the box of resistance to a government, any government. Assad is a government. That is terrorism. Now, whatever your legal prowess or not, it takes common sense and simple morality to say if that's the law, it cannot be just, it cannot be lawful, it cannot be right. And if, as Moazzam said, our own government, Haig was standing up in Parliament at the time, saying at all costs this regime has to be taken away. We do not recognise Assad as the lawful regime. Well, if our government does not recognise it as the lawful regime, what are we doing prosecuting people for resisting that government? And so in a number of cases, the defendants decided with their lawyers to mount an aggressive pre-trial strategy. Moazzam was one. Moazzam said, this is what I did. I went to train people to fight so that they would not be killed in the process of defending the Syrian people. Simple. If that's unlawful, then that's what it is. But I do not believe it's lawful. I believe there is an international obligation and a moral duty and an international defence of self-defence. It's basic self-defence. It cannot be trumped by terrorism. Self-defence is an entitlement of the human race. And terrorism, whatever the expansion of the definition, cannot take it away. And so the aggressive strategy of saying in advance of a trial, this is my defence, it's not going to be an ambush defence, there's no secret, this is what I'm saying, I was there in Syria, in Aleppo or Idlib. We're not talking about ISIS, we're not talking about prescribed organisations, we're talking about defending the Syrian people. Saying, okay, this is my defence. Having said it, you, the government, have a duty to disclose. Prosecution, we want disclosed to us precisely what the government knows about the shipping of arms covertly from Libya via Qatar to Turkey in trucks to the rebels. We want to know what MI5, MI6 were sitting in those meetings. We know they've been mentioned in the press. We can see enough to know it's not speculative. Tell us. And we want to know what you mean by supplying non-lethal support to rebel forces. If you're supplying non-lethal material support to rebel forces, night goggles, body armour, machines, trucks, that is supporting terrorist act. So we want all the details of that, please, too. Moazzam's case was dropped without explanation. The next man's case, Ben Hamidi, a young Libyan who fought in the Libyan Revolution, was accused of supporting Syrian resistance. That case suddenly dropped. Next one, Berlin Gildo, Swedish man, on to Syria, joined the fight, gone back to Sweden, had the great misfortune to be taking a flight in transit through Heathrow. Nothing to do with England, no connection connection with England, arrested and charged with terrorist activity because of what he'd done. Not a crime in Sweden, not a crime in Syria, but going through that case, suddenly dropped. So what I'm trying to say here is there is no place in the criminal law for uncertainty. The law is meant to be clear. Every person is meant to know how he or she can adjust their behaviour so they know are they transgressing the law or not. But it's not only our prisons are full of young people who should not be there, who have not, in all morality or fact or conscience, transgressed any law that can properly be called law. It's not that. It's not just that. The penumbra beyond those people is terrified too. The wives of people who've been to Syria, who fear their children are about to be taken away, and the social services looking at whether the children are radicalised or not. Little tiny children. It's a nonsense. Charity workers who've given their lives since 2011 to driving convoys to Syria, taking aid. Terrified, because are they being arrested or not for contributing? Charities, the chilling effect on giving money. Are we breaking the law or not? It isn't just the enormity of an individual going to prison. The taking away of freedom, the taking away of life, the taking away of everything dear to a person. It isn't just that, it's the imprisoning of minds and choices and freedom, breathing free. That's all been taken away too, so that there is an imprisonment of thinking. And who are the prisoners? Who are the jailers? All of us who just let it happen.
Solidarity, that's what you have to go across those borders. And I don't know if it's the regressive left, progressive left, or the subversive left, dismissive left, but you know, without some form of solidarity between us, we're all screwed.
Sorry, if I can just make a comment. I understand the sentiment of the question, but I think it's important that we try to work with people, and we shouldn't really necessarily pigeonhole them, because we'll find people who are on the right to be more than willing to help out. And of course I understand, you know, what you're trying to get at, but I think that pigeonholes perhaps may make an obstacle in helping or even operating.
Yeah, my question draws on that help, and the question for Gareth and Moazzam. From my experience, is so I was working for a corporate and I wanted to give testimony, clinical testimony, and fly to America, and my director and the leadership team opposed it, and they said that I would be sacked for that threat. So I went anyway, but to give a physical testimony just in case, just so I didn't lose my job. Which then questions, my question is, doesn't the justice system, well, I was made redundant inevitably anyway, and that was big prices, gold prices, but my question is, doesn't this come from a justice system that relies on testimonies and physical personal statements when people are not given that comfort of giving testimonies with some protection, and that the case can be helped with the testimony? I mean, how would you go about that? How can people help other than giving testimonies? So it's actually a question, I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is there are people who want to help, and there are testimonies. Actually, this is kind of stopped by the justice system.
Can I add a question to the lady's question? It's kind of linked. I mean, just to you, Gareth, do you think the courtroom scenario with the judges proceeding the cases that have Muslims or a terrorist-related case, do you think, in your opinion, the judges are impartial in these situations, or do you think they're deliberately maybe trying to make a point and put a precedent by giving the harshest penalty so as to create that fear even more so, to kind of resonate and get the titles and put a message out there. Whereas in reality, if they was to genuinely assess the case, maybe it wouldn't deserve a 10, 13-year sentence. It could maybe just do with a 2-year sentence. Whatever the situation is, I don't have the details to it. I'm just putting a hypothetical situation, a scenario. Does that make sense?
I think there's a complete lack of comprehension of the politics or morality of world conflicts and a person's situation within a world they didn't make and a conflict they didn't make. There is no comprehension, there's no memory within judges of what is appropriate or not. So that's why you can have these vastly different sentences at the moment in relation to Syria, just insane differences. There was no comprehension of the judge in Anis Sardar's case that Iraq was the most horrible, terrible, brutal, unjust situation.
They don't seem to be even exercising any sort of...
In fact, Anis has got leave to appeal, ironically, on sentence, but not on conviction. Sorry, are you coming this way to shut me up?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm done. Yeah. Witnesses.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, again, in Anis's case, one of the Americans in uniform was given anonymity because he's still working in the military in that sensitive position. So he was known as ABC to her. However, because of our application, which apparently has never been made before in a criminal trial, just never come up, for equivalent anonymity for the defence witnesses, which was even more necessary because they had families still in Baghdad or in the same. There is no equivalent provision in the law. Given there's meant to be a concept of equality of arms, there was no equality of arms, so that is a point on appeal. But it's a pretty, look, it's difficult enough to get witnesses in cases anywhere. Ordinary case, traffic accident, to get a witness in what's flagged up as a terrorist case is almost takes a very brave person. To get a witness in a case for your family, where you ring up the mother the night with your mother the night before you agreed to give evidence in Anis's case, and she says, "Listen, my son, do you understand your uncles, your father, your cousins have all been killed? Do you want to get the rest of us killed? What can that person do?" So,
Yeah, just
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Pierce. First of all, thank you for speaking here today at SOAS. There was an allusion made to the Irish experience by various speakers joining on the table this evening. I know that some years ago you had written a very interesting article entitled "What's It Like This for the Irish?" I was wondering perhaps if you could answer that question. What is this like for the... How apt is the comparison? Is the situation that the Muslim community faces as a community and individual suspects that have been arrested for terrorist or under anti-terrorism law, is the Irish comparison an apt comparison? Could you tell us in your estimation, is it worse now than it was for them? It's basically my question.
it was a very long essay. We haven't got wrong. There are resonances. Moazzam would tell you that when he went to Derry, he felt at home. People in Derry would tell you when Moazzam went to Derry, this was a brother who understood. No, nothing is the same. Conflict in Ireland was an armed struggle with a cohesive community involved in that struggle. So relatively confined. There was an organisation, the IRA, which was hierarchical. It had its own objective and strategy. It was reactive to what British soldiers had done, the massacre of Bloody Sunday. Before that, the IRA could not get recruits. After Bloody Sunday, volunteers were there for the next 25 years. Because it was 800 years of memory echoed within that community, because there were international allies, 40 million Americans of Irish descent, there were allies abroad who could be lobbied, persuaded to pressure the British authorities. This is a different experience, totally different experience, and it's propelled by a narrative, and that I see as a narrative that was begun by Blair, that is still being pursued one way or another, and which involves this government in being in alliance with whichever oppressive regime suits its economical, strategic, perceived economical, strategic purposes. So Syria is a proxy war going on now, in which the Syrians are forgotten. There are echoes, there are differences, but we are insane to forget what we learned from history. We are insane that injustice breeds reaction.
Yeah, just this.
My name is Farooqi. I'm the daughter of Munir Farooqi, who my brother Harris he spoke about in regards to Free Munir campaign. I just wanted to make a comment in regards to my father, where he's been in prison for 6 years now, and he's been in prison purely due to the use of undercover officers and the way they infiltrated our family home as well as the community at large. Not only did they destroy our family, but my father being very well known in the community, where even till this day there's a Christian minister who is a very close friend of his who goes to visit him within the prison itself. So a lot of people have been affected by this and recognise this injustice. So I urge you all to please to get involved in the campaign and inshallah join and help in every way you can. Because if this can happen to a man whose crime is only to care and to be compassionate and to be there to help people, this can happen to absolutely any one of us. And also, one question for Gareth is this whole use of undercover officers throughout my father's trial. Whenever my father's barrister raised the use of undercover officers, the judge always said, well, this was something legal and nothing was done outside of the law. So is there any way we can actually tackle the actual concept of the use of undercover officers, because it's so deceitful and blasphemous?
Actually, when I first heard about your father's prosecution, the one thing that went through my head was the blasphemy of pretending to be converted. The blasphemy of pretending that. That seemed extraordinary to me. It seemed extraordinary that he's conceived that was a legitimate technique. There is an inquiry just beginning into undercover policing. Undercover policing is lawful, but there are undercover police who behave unlawfully, and the inquiry is into what first came to light of police who have relationships with women, deceiving them because they were in protest campaigns, having children with them, and then disappearing. So that inquiry is now extended because since the publicity range of other undercover policing is has come to light. In your father's case, the judge, I presume, made a, I'm sorry, I'll incorrect, but the judge, I presume, made a ruling it was lawful. But it would be very interesting to explore the extent to which, if you obtain the consent of a woman that is not informed because she doesn't know you're a policeman, is that analogous to obtaining a relationship with someone who's giving dawah when it's a falsity? There is an equivalency there. I haven't thought it through, I'm sorry, and it's an inadequate answer, but there's something, as you say, so fundamentally obscene about the misapplication of religious faith, just as the misapplication of human love and intimacy. That there seems to be some form of argument that they should be perceived as an intrusion into fundamental rights of freedom of thought, freedom of association and privacy, Article 8 and 10 of the European Convention.
Can I, in Munir Farooqi's case, there is something that's really important, and that various studies show that numerous people convert to Islam on a regular basis, and Muslims, as we know, are facing all sorts of discrimination, particularly for people who are regarded as converts or reverts. What this case has done is such a great deal of fear, hostility, apprehension, and discord within the community. Imagine how people must feel towards those people who are now new Muslims. A suspicion, and the type of sense people must get as to, is this person real? Are they genuine? Should I trust them? Should I bring them home? Should I be good to them? Should I keep them at a distance? All of that is something that the government should be held to task for introducing this type of feeling within the community. It can only be divisive. And as I think Nikki was saying earlier on, one of the things that needs to happen is people need to come together, but clearly one of the tactics that the government has constantly used is to divide and rule. And it's easy to divide people who are of different communities and so forth, but imagine how effective it would be to divide the same community. And I think that's also part of the consequence of this.
In fact, with Kerry Woodman, when you were under a control order from your friend Arthur Young, who is not a Muslim, and our tribe approached him and said, could you go to the mosque and spy on things for us? And he said, but basic fundamental problem, I'm not Muslim. And they said, oh, well, that's good, because Muslims give it extra love and welcome to people who are converting. That was the most cynical, extraordinary approach.
We've just got room for 2 more questions.
Okay, I'd like to say so many things because this throws up so many questions, but I'll keep it very short because we've got a lot of time. Firstly, I'd like to say I'd like to commend the campaigners, and I'm really glad that my comrades are part of this so-called progressive left to recognise that the working class and oppressed people who are affected by racism and so on are not just, like a few privileged trade unionists or whatever, or they're not necessarily in the Labour Party, and this includes the people who are on the receiving end of imperialist war in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Muslims here as well, inside and outside of prison. One thing I wanted to raise is this Saturday, many of you will be aware of a protest at Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre. I'm going to leave some flyers there for it. I think it's important that a lot of concrete action comes out of this meeting, even if for some of us it will be limited for time and so on. If we do like these pages on Facebook, we do share their materials, we do tweet them out. It's not just giving people a voice inside, as Nikki has said, but I've met many of these comrades who've come out, having been inside, having not been political, having been politicised, and indeed reverted inside prison, and they've fought battles in there. They went in there, very nice, gentle people, for crimes they didn't commit, crimes they did commit. I'll give the example of Satpal Ram, who's who's a wonderful, gentle guy, who was accused of killing someone as a murder. Personally, I don't care whether it was or it wasn't. It was in self-defense against racism, and he was being sent books by the organisation. He was reading about great Marxist revolutionaries, black revolutionaries, George Jackson, and that gave him strength. So we need to think, do we have any brothers or sisters inside? Do we know anyone inside? And we need to be communicating with them, trying to improve things for them inside, and for when they eventually hopefully come out. But just going back to this quickly, it's important that we make this the biggest one yet. This is another type of prison for the Muslims, an immigration detention centre where women and men are subjected to sexual abuse, where they are forced to do unpaid labour and so on. And then finally, I did want to say, whilst commending your work that you've done historically, I think we shouldn't use the rhetoric of saying Tony Blair said this and it was terrible about Iraq and Afghanistan, and then justify foreign intervention in countries which now barely even exist. Libya, for example, I'm still waiting to see the fruits of this revolution. Syria and so on. When I speak to my comrades from around these places, they weren't calling for any revolution. NATO is in there destroying their country, and it's our job to defend their right to self-determination, not to determine it for them from the belly of an imperialist beast.
Do you want anyone responding to that comment, or Rosa?
Exactly, that was up for ages.
Oh, yeah.
No, I want to ask Gareth, sorry, everyone's asking you your own experiences. I don't know if you have experience, I think you do, dealing with IPPs, and if you've got any experience in challenging them?
Well, one coercive measure has now morphed into another. So the son of IPP has become something called notification of so-called terrorist conviction. So that a person who has been convicted of a terrorist offence under terrorism legislation that gets a sentence of more than 12 months is subject to notification for 10 years upwards, 10, 15, up to 30 years, i.e. practically the rest of someone's life. They're subject to provisions. They have to report to police if they're going to stay at home, be away from home more than, I think it's 7 nights in a year or more than 3 nights in succession. That has to be reported to the authorities. There are probation requirements. You have to convince probation that you are not radicalised. So there is a whole structure now that you don't need that term that was frightening at one time, IPP. This is the new normal.
But you had no success in challenging any from the start of IPP?
There are challenges going on the whole time, legally. But one, there are decisions that IPPs are no longer to be a useful device, but that doesn't alleviate the people who are already subject to IPPs. I'm sure it's more than a million terms of your work.
I recognise the Ashton. I think it's this comrade.
Hamid?
Yes. But by and large, the only legal basis on which anyone seems to manage to challenge the imposition of an IPP now is if the judge, when they imposed it, didn't properly consider whether they could have imposed an extended sentence instead. And that's quite narrow, but sometimes it works. It's worked for 1 or 2 people outside of the political spectrum who are very young, and they didn't consider that. But other than that, and even if you're way years late, they could still do it. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be any sort of light at the end of the tunnel in that. If you've got an IPP, it doesn't matter how much the law has changed, you've still got an IPP. And you probably know, when they took the IPP, it's very technical, but when they rescinded the IPP law, part of the new legislation